The final verdict has been delivered. On July 23, 2025, Bryan Kohberger, once a criminology student obsessed with understanding criminal minds, was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition to these life sentences, he received an extra 10 years for burglary, closing the legal chapter on one of the most haunting mass murder cases in recent American history. After nearly 3 years of national speculation, courtroom delays, and mounting psychological intrigue, the trial ended not with a dramatic testimony, but with a calculated silence. Koberger, who once studied the patterns of killers, is now legally categorized among them. There were no last words, no public confession, no attempt to explain what drove him to murder 4 young students in their home in the dead of night. He simply stood, expressionless, as Judge John C. Hippler handed down the sentence, calling him a faceless coward whose acts were cold, calculated, and inhuman. The weight of the moment did not come from Koberger's reaction, there was none, but from the palpable grief and rage that filled the courtroom. And as the judge finalized the ruling, the silence that followed said more than any statement the defendant could have made. This moment marks not only the conclusion of a criminal case, but the beginning of a deeper reflection. A man who trained to understand deviant behavior is now its living embodiment, a scholar of crime who used theory to commit reality. Now, let's take a closer look at what happened inside the courtroom, the words that were spoken, the emotions that surfaced, and the psychological tension that filled the air. But before we continue, take a second to make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. That way, you don't miss any of the stories that matter and disturb. The courtroom was heavy with emotion, not because of raised voices, but because of what wasn't said. When the families of the victims were finally given a voice, their words struck with a quiet intensity that no forensic detail or legal argument ever could. Each statement was more than grief, it was a psychological rupture. The father of Kaylee Goncalves spoke with trembling fury, describing the moment he had to identify his daughter's body. He paused, visibly choking back the unbearable image, and then looked directly at Koberger, saying, "You stole her laughter, her future, and for what? A twisted experiment?" That single line captured what prosecutors had struggled to articulate for months, that these murders were not just violent, they were senseless. Other family members echoed that sense of violated reality. One mother wept as she described how she still sets a place for her daughter at the dinner table. A sibling of one of the victims spoke softly, saying they no longer dream, only relive the night in different forms. The courtroom didn't need dramatic music or screaming to feel tragic. It felt like a psychological vacuum, where time had frozen around one incomprehensible truth. These young lives ended not because of chance, but because someone chose to study them and then extinguish them. Throughout it all, Koberger sat motionless. No remorse, no tears, no acknowledgement. His eyes stayed fixed forward, as if the statements were happening in another room. That blank stare became more disturbing with every passing word, creating a silent contrast to the raw pain unfolding in front of him. To many in the room, that lack of emotion confirmed what they feared most, that this wasn't just a man who made a terrible decision. This was a man who felt nothing about it. Even the judge appeared emotionally affected. At one point, he took a long pause before continuing, his voice slightly cracking. "No sentence," he said, "can return what was taken, but justice requires that the weight of the law matches the weight of the loss." And in that moment, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about bearing witness to pain, acknowledging the psychological devastation, and refusing to let it be minimized. What happens when a mind obsessed with understanding crime decides to participate in it? This question haunted every minute of the trial. Bryan Kohberger was not a man unfamiliar with violence. He was a man fascinated by its structure. He didn't arrive at these murders through impulse or chaos. He arrived through curiosity, through method, through theory. Experts who reviewed Koberger's academic history noted a disturbing pattern, an escalating interest in the minds of killers, paired with detachment from ethical boundaries. In online forums, he asked convicted criminals to describe their thoughts and emotions during their crimes. In class, he debated the motivations behind serial killings with unnerving calm. Some colleagues recall a student who seemed more intrigued by the logic of crime than by the suffering it caused. That line between academic inquiry and personal fascination blurred, then vanished. During the trial, his former professors were subpoenaed. One admitted under oath that Koberger once submitted a paper describing the disconnect between theoretical control and emotional failure in violent acts. At the time, it read like academic speculation. Now, it felt like foreshadowing. Psychologists brought in by the prosecution painted a chilling portrait, a man who intellectualized morality to the point of erasure, a man who may have used his education not to prevent violence, but to perfect it. In their words, this wasn't simply a case of a student gone astray. It was the collapse of someone who believed he could outthink his own conscience. This psychological unraveling became even more evident as the trial progressed. Koberger's defense attempted to argue for misidentification, yet provided no plausible alternative suspect. His own silence, both in court and to the press, fed the narrative that he was not simply misunderstood, but calculated, measured. Someone who rehearsed every detail, but failed to rehearse empathy. Observers noted the contrast between his academic ambitions and the grotesque nature of the crimes. It was as if the pursuit of knowledge, untethered from humanity, had spiraled into something monstrous. And this led to a deeper question that lingered in the courtroom and beyond. Was this always his path? Or did something snap when the theories were no longer enough? When the case studies stopped satisfying his hunger for understanding and only real bloodshed could provide the answers. The courtroom was silent as Bryan Kohberger walked in, flanked by guards. It was July 23rd, Judgment Day. After months of speculation, psychological evaluations, and witness testimony, the moment had finally come. The sentence itself wasn't a surprise. 4 first-degree murder charges, aggravated burglary, every count confirmed. The prosecution, firm in its stance, sought the harshest penalty, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The jury agreed unanimously. And just like that, the man who once studied the patterns of killers had become the living embodiment of one, condemned not just by evidence, but by the echo of his own intellect turned inward. But it wasn't the verdict that haunted the room. It was the expressions, the faces of the victims' families. The long exhale of pain that had been held for over a year. One father clutched a photo of his daughter. Another mother stared at Koberger, unmoving. It wasn't relief. It was resignation, because justice, though served, cannot undo an empty chair at dinner or the silence left behind by stolen laughter. As the judge read the sentencing, Koberger remained expressionless. No apology, no visible remorse, only a sterile calm, like a man observing his own fate from behind academic glass. To some, that was the most chilling part of all. Psychological analysts watching the proceedings pointed to what they called emotional vacancy, a flatness in his demeanor that aligns with traits seen in individuals with narcissistic and psychopathic profiles. It raised a final question. Was the sentence truly punishment for him, or merely an ending to his experiment? Outside the courtroom, reporters echoed what many were feeling, that this case was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about the failure of knowledge without conscience, about a mind that tried to dissect morality until there was nothing left but control. And now, with the sentence finalized, a chapter closes, but not neatly, because the damage isn't confined to a courtroom. It ripples through families, through trust, through our collective sense of safety. Before we continue, if you're finding this analysis valuable, remember to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and check your subscription to the channel Criminal Psychology Unmasked. so você não perca os próximos casos que expõem a face mais sombria da mente humana. Now, let's explore what led Bryan Kohberger to this moment, his background, his evolution, and the hidden signals that may have warned us all. Long before he became the face of a nationally broadcast trial, Bryan Kohberger was a quiet, observant boy growing up in Pennsylvania. He wasn't the kind of child that raised red flags, not in the traditional sense. Teachers described him as intelligent, withdrawn, sometimes intensely focused, but beneath that exterior, there were fractures forming. High school peers would later recall unsettling moments, an obsession with control, sudden outbursts of anger, and a growing detachment from social norms. He was bullied for his weight, struggled with feelings of inadequacy, and according to some reports, began exhibiting signs of obsessive-compulsive behaviors and social isolation. Koberger's turn toward criminology wasn't born of mere curiosity. It seemed personal. He studied it with rigor, diving deep into the psychological mechanisms of killers. He enrolled in psychology, then criminal justice, and eventually began a PhD in criminology. His academic performance was strong, but what fascinated professors most was his intense fixation on the cognitive and emotional triggers behind violent crime. One particular red flag came during his graduate research. He published surveys online asking convicted criminals about how they chose their victims, how they felt during the act, and how they prepared. The tone was clinical, but the questions struck some researchers as alarmingly intimate, as if the boundary between study and identification was blurring. At home, those close to him described a man of extreme routines, a need for order, a mind that spiraled inward. There was no history of violence, but there was tension, pressure, a personality folding under the weight of its own internal scrutiny. And then, something shifted. Around the time of the Idaho murders, Koberger's behavior reportedly became more erratic. Sleepless nights, sudden disappearances, whispers of paranoia. The clinical detachment that once served him in academia had seemingly spilled into real life. The lines between analysis and action had been crossed. Understanding Koberger isn't about finding an excuse, it's about identifying the tipping points. What kind of mental pattern breaks in silence? What combination of isolation, intellect, and identity distortion leads a man from studying crime to orchestrating it? The psychology behind this transition is what truly unsettles, because it speaks not of madness in the cinematic sense, but of calculation, of someone who saw others as data, who may have treated the crime as an experiment with human consequences. The court has spoken, and this time with absolute finality. Bryan Kohberger, the man who for months stood at the center of speculation, fear, and psychological analysis, has been sentenced. 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 additional years for felony burglary. A definitive outcome for a story that blurred the line between theory and horrifying reality. The sentence itself is cold, clinical, but it lands on a landscape of emotional devastation. 4 young lives, brutally taken, families left shattered, forced to relive each moment through hearings, headlines, and memories. And even now, with justice served, no court ruling can erase the images, the sounds, the futures that were stolen. Throughout the trial, Koberger remained composed, silent, analytical, watching himself unravel as if he were an observer of someone else's story. There was no visible regret, no plea for mercy, just that same vacant stare, the gaze of a man who once studied criminal minds and who had now become a textbook himself. The defense tried to argue technicalities. They pointed out inconsistencies, tried to shift doubt onto the investigation, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA, digital footprints, cell tower data, behavioral patterns that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. To the jury, the line between the criminologist and the killer was unmistakably clear. And perhaps that was Koberger's greatest miscalculation, believing that studying crime meant mastering it. That understanding how murderers think and how investigators work would grant him immunity. But theory doesn't prepare you for the emotional chaos of real life, for the persistence of detectives, for the voices of grieving families who refuse to be silenced. His sentence doesn't bring peace, but it brings closure, a legal ending to a psychological nightmare. And most importantly, it locks him into a future of silence. The silence of a cell, of time without escape, of knowing that 4 lives ended because of him. We're left to reflect. How many seemingly ordinary people are carrying dangerous storms within? Koberger had no criminal record. He was a student, a researcher, a man of intellect. Yet he crossed the line from understanding violence to becoming its author. And that leaves us with an unsettling question. How well can we ever truly know anyone? If you've watched this far, you're not just seeking headlines, you're searching for understanding. And that's why Criminal Psychology Unmasked exists. To reflect, to explore, and to give voice to the human mind's darkest corners. So if you haven't already, like this video right now, it helps bring depth and context to more people. Leave a comment below. What struck you most about this trial? His detachment, his intelligence turned against itself, or the unhealed wounds left behind? And make sure you're subscribed to the channel Criminal Psychology Unmasked, so you never miss our deep dives into the minds of those who broke all boundaries. In our next episode, we'll uncover a new case, one that shook the world in its own way, and challenges everything we think we know about human behavior. See you in the next episode.